The morning I found out my husband was bankrupt, I was standing barefoot in our kitchen holding a bank statement that said our joint account had less than $90 left. Richard had spent years laughing at my pottery, calling it a waste of time, old lady nonsense, and mud nobody needed. But what he didn't know was that every bowl, every mug, every little receipt from my tiny online shop had been quietly building the one thing he couldn't take from me, proof. And by the time his lies collapsed, my so-called hobby was the only reason I didn't collapse with him. Before I tell you what Richard really did, please like this video if you've ever had something you loved dismissed by someone close to you. Subscribe if you believe women deserve justice at any age. And tell me in the comments where you're watching, from what time it is there, and what you would have done in my place. My name is Annabelle Scott, and by the time this happened, I was 62 years old and living in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in the same yellow-sided house where I had spent almost half my life trying to be the kind of wife who kept everything from falling apart. I had once worked part-time at the public library downtown. I loved that job more than I ever admitted out loud. I loved the quiet hum of the return desk, the smell of old paper and floor polish, the little conversations with regulars who checked out mysteries, biographies, and church cookbooks, as if those books were medicine. But life has a way of pulling women like me out of the places we love and placing us where we are needed most. My mother's health had started failing in my 50s, and Richard's construction business was expanding, as he liked to say. So I retired early. That was the polite word for it. In truth, I stepped away from my life so I could hold everyone else's together. I drove my mother to appointments. I organized pill bottles. I learned how to cook low-sodium meals she hated and gentle soups she could swallow on the hard days. I kept the house clean, the laundry folded, the thank you cards sent, the birthdays remembered, and the casseroles warm when Richard came home late and irritable from a job site. For years, I told myself that was enough, that building a family quietly and invisibly was a kind of work that didn't need applause. Then my mother died. People talk about grief as if it arrives like thunder, loud and dramatic, impossible to miss. My grief did not. Mine came like winter in Iowa. It crept under the doors. It settled into the walls. It hollowed out the rooms slowly until even my own kitchen didn't feel like a place I belonged in anymore. After the funeral, casseroles came and went. Sympathy cards stopped arriving. Richard returned to work as if sorrow had an expiration date, and I found myself standing in the middle of long afternoons with no one to care for and no idea what to do with my hands. That was how the pottery began. Not beautifully, not gracefully, and certainly not with any grand plan. One Saturday, I wandered into a local artisan market because I couldn't bear another hour inside the house. Near the back of the building, beside a booth selling handmade soaps and beeswax candles, there was a woman demonstrating wheel-thrown pottery. Her hands were calm. That's what I remember most. Calm. The clay spun under her palms and rose into shape as if it wanted to become something. A bowl, a mug, a vessel. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching wet earth turn into beauty. And for the first time in months, I felt something inside me lean forward instead of shut down. The next week, I signed up for a beginner's class at a community arts center. I didn't tell Richard until after I'd already gone to the first session. He looked up from his dinner when I mentioned it, fork halfway to his mouth. "Pottery," he said with that dry little laugh of his. "What are you going to do? Start making ashtrays like it's 1978? I smiled the way women smile when they are trying to keep the peace. "It's just a class." He shrugged. "Well, if it keeps you busy." At first, that was all it was. A class on Tuesday evenings. My hands clumsy and uncertain. Clay collapsing in on itself. Walls too thick. Handles uneven. Glazes turning out muddy when I wanted them soft and warm. But there was something about it. Something honest. Clay did not care whether I was a good wife, a grieving daughter, or a woman who had given up too much for too long. It only responded to touch patience, pressure, and time. If I rushed it, it cracked. If I ignored it, it dried out. If I learned its rhythm, it held. I started bringing small pieces home. A lopsided bowl, a spoon rest, a mug with a crooked handle I was embarrassingly proud of. I set up a folding table in the garage with a second-hand lamp, cheap tools, and bags of clay stacked beside old paint cans. It wasn't glamorous. In winter, the garage was cold enough to sting my fingers, and in summer, it smelled faintly of dust and cut grass. But it became the first place in years that felt like mine. Richard hated that almost immediately, not loudly at first. Richard rarely began loudly. He began with jokes, with dismissals, with the kind of comments that could be passed off as harmless if you repeated them back to someone else. You spent all afternoon on that. It's just mud, Annabelle. How many bowls does one woman think the world needs? The one I remember most came on a gray Thursday afternoon when I had laid out 3 freshly glazed mugs to dry on an old wire shelf. He stood in the garage doorway in his work boots, looking at them as if they were proof of some embarrassing condition. "You spend hours making things nobody needs," he said. "At your age, shouldn't you be relaxing instead of playing in dirt at your age?" I cannot explain to anyone younger how those 4 words can land in a woman's chest. Not because age itself is shameful, but because some people say it as if your life should already be over. As if curiosity, creativity, delight, ambition, and self-discovery have expiration dates. As if there comes a point when a woman's only acceptable role is to fade quietly into usefulness and ask for nothing. I said nothing back then. I wiped glaze off my fingertips and let the silence answer for me. But I kept going. What Richard never understood was that I wasn't making pottery because I thought it would turn me into an artist. I was making it because it gave shape to hours that would have otherwise turned heavy and dark. I was making it because after my mother died, I needed to see that my hands could still create something instead of only clean up after loss. I was making it because every finished cup and bowl whispered a truth I had almost forgotten. I still existed apart from what I did for other people. Months passed. My pieces improved. The walls got thinner. The glazes became steadier. I learned which clay bodies held heat well, which handles felt best in older hands, which soft cream and blue finishes made people linger when they picked up a mug. I started carving simple details into the clay wildflower stems. Tiny hearts, wheat patterns, initials. Nothing flashy, just pieces that felt warm, familiar, and made to be used in real kitchens by real people. One afternoon, after a friend from church bought 2 of my mugs and told me I ought to sell them, I laughed it off. But that night, I kept thinking about it. Not the money, not at first. The idea. The possibility that something I made could travel beyond my garage and be held in someone else's hands. So I opened a small Etsy shop. I named it Belle's Hearth Pottery because Annabelle's pottery felt too plain and because I liked the word hearth. It sounded like warmth. Home. A place where things endure. I took photos on an old white bedsheet near the back window where the light was best. I wrote descriptions more carefully than I had written anything in years. Hand-thrown stoneware mug. Glazed in soft linen white. Made for quiet mornings and steady hands. I listed 6 items and then spent 3 straight days checking the page every few hours, embarrassed by my own hope. The first order came from a woman in Ohio who bought a blue speckled mug for her sister. I nearly cried when I saw it. Not because it was a lot of money. It wasn't. By the time Etsy took its share and I paid for shipping supplies, I had made almost nothing. But someone I had never met had chosen a thing my hands made. She had typed in her card number, trusted my little shop, and waited for that package to arrive. That mattered to me more than I can say. Then came another order, then 2 in 1 week. A ring dish, a pair of mugs, a small vase. I didn't talk much about it with Richard. That was partly because he wasn't interested, and partly because I had started to notice something in myself that felt both new and fragile. I liked having something that wasn't his. Not secret in a shameful way. Just separate. My own small corner of dignity. So when Etsy asked where I wanted payouts deposited, I opened a separate checking account. I told myself it was practical, easier bookkeeping, cleaner records for taxes, simpler to track shipping costs and supply expenses. All of that was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that even then, before I knew anything specific, something in me had begun to brace. Richard's moods had become sharper over the years. His need to control the money, the schedule, the atmosphere in the room. It had all grown so gradually I had almost stopped naming it. Yet somewhere deep inside me, quieter than fear, but steadier, a voice had begun to say, "Keep something of your own." I listened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to save the receipts. Just enough to keep the bank account in my name. Just enough to photograph each piece before shipping it out. Just enough to hold on to proof that I had made something real. At the time, I thought I was only protecting a hobby. I had no idea I was protecting my future. When you've been married to a man for nearly 4 decades, people assume you know exactly who he is. That is one of the cruelest lies marriage can tell. If you had met Richard Scott in our early years, you would have liked him. Most people did. He had a steady handshake, a deep voice that made even ordinary promises sound reliable, and the kind of smile that seemed to say he could carry more than other men. When I was 24, and foolish in all the hopeful ways I thought that meant safety, I thought a man who spoke with confidence would live with integrity. I thought if he worked hard and came home tired, that was proof of love. And to be fair, in this beginning, Richard did love me. Or at least he loved the version of me that fit neatly inside the life he wanted to build. Back then, he was just a foreman with a used pickup truck, a rolled-up set of blueprints in the cab, and a head full of plans. We rented a little apartment with thin walls and uneven heat. I worked, he worked, and on Fridays, we split a pizza and dreamed about a house with a yard. He used to kiss my forehead when I fell asleep on the sofa. He used to ask what book I was reading and listen to the answer. He used to bring me wildflowers from empty lots near construction sites as if beauty had to be rescued before it was paved over. I remember those things because I have spent years wondering when they stopped being enough for him. The business changed first. It started small. Richard left his employer and launched his own company, Scott & Sons Renovations, even though at the time, there were no sons old enough to work with him, and only one daughter still in high school. He said the name sounded established. Solid, trustworthy. I supported him completely. I helped pick the logo. I answered calls from the kitchen when he was on job sites. I filed invoices. I mailed checks. I spent entire evenings with receipts spread across the table while he talked about growth overhead subcontractors' bids and margins. And for a while it worked. He got bigger jobs. Kitchen remodels became commercial tenant finishes. Small repairs became full renovations. He hired crews, bought a second truck, then a newer one, then one with leather seats and chrome details that seemed too polished for a man who still insisted he was just blue collar. The money got better. Not wildly, not at first, but enough that Richard began to carry himself differently. Enough that he started to confuse looking successful with being successful. That was the beginning of the shift. Richard became a man who liked an audience. He joined a country club outside town, though he barely golfed. He started taking clients to restaurants where the plates were too small and the lighting too flattering. He bought tailored jackets he claimed were necessary for bigger rooms. He began saying things like image matters in business in the same tone other people use to say grace. I stayed the same. that I think embarrassed him more than he ever admitted. I still preferred a quiet evening at home over a banquet room full of strangers. I still wore my practical shoes and simple cardigans. I still clipped recipes from church newsletters and borrowed novels from the library even after I stopped working there. I still found more pleasure in planting marigolds by the front steps than in pretending I cared about imported whiskey or market positioning. And once pottery entered my life, I grew even less interested in the performance Richard seemed to require from the world around him. He noticed that. He noticed everything that did not reflect his chosen image. At first, he only made little comments when I posted my pottery online. "You really need to put that on Facebook. Do your church friends have to see you covered in clay? Annabelle, honestly, it makes us look cheap. Us." That word always struck me. Not me, not you. Us. As if my harmless little photos of handmade mugs were somehow dragging down the grand reputation he imagined hovering over our ranch-style house in Cedar Rapids. As if my joy reflected badly on him. I still remember the first night he humiliated me in public over it. We were out at a restaurant downtown with another couple, Thomas and Carol Whitaker, and two men Richard was hoping to impress into some future partnership. Thomas had known Richard for years. They golfed together twice a month and liked to call each other old dog, in that way men do when they want to sound loyal without ever saying anything vulnerable. Carol, on the other hand, was warm and observant. The kind of woman who noticed if your lipstick had worn off, or if your smile didn't quite reach your eyes. Dinner had gone, the way those dinners always went. Men talking loudly about contracts, labor shortages, city permits, and opportunities, while the wives were expected to laugh in the right places and never ask a question that exposed the fragile machinery of masculine ego. At some point, Carol turned to me and said, "Thomas showed me that little mug you made for his office. It was lovely. Do you sell those?" It was such a gentle question, such a normal one, and I made the mistake of lighting up. "I do, actually," I said. "Just a small online shop, nothing fancy. Mostly mugs and bowls and things for Richard." Cut across me with a chuckle. "She's being modest," he said, lifting his wine glass. "Annabelle's got herself a little senior craft empire." The table laughed politely. I felt my smile freeze. Richard went on enjoying himself now. "By empire, I mean she plays with clay in the garage and makes bowls nobody needs. But hey, it keeps her busy." One of the men across from us smirked into his drink. Thomas laughed too loudly. Carol's face changed just slightly, but I saw it. She knew. Women always know when another woman has just been made small on purpose. I wanted to disappear, not because I was ashamed of the pottery. I wasn't. Not really. I was ashamed of being reduced in public by the man who was supposed to protect my dignity, not perform its execution between the salad and the entree. I kept my eyes on my plate. Carol, bless her, tried once more. "Well, I think handmade things matter. People are tired of everything looking the same." But Richard was enjoying the role too much now. Maybe he said, "But I'm still waiting for one of those mugs to pay for a steak dinner." More laughter. More heat creeping into my face. More silence from me because sometimes silence is the only way to keep from breaking open in front of people who will never understand what they are seeing. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. I nodded when required, smiled when cornered, stirred melting ice in my water, and wished I had driven separately. Then, just as the check arrived, Thomas said something that didn't fit. He was speaking to one of the men beside him, half joking, half serious, and he said, "Well, if the new investor money lands the way Richard thinks it will, I guess none of us will have to worry by fall." I looked up. Richard didn't, but I saw his jaw tighten. It happened fast. So fast that another person might have missed it. He reached for the check, forced a laugh, and changed the subject before anyone could linger there. But something had shifted in the room. A note played off-key. A crack in the varnish. New investor money. That phrase sat in my mind the whole drive home. The city lights thinned behind us. Richard drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, radio low. I waited until we were stopped at a red light before I asked as evenly as I could, "What did Thomas mean about investor money?" Richard didn't answer right away. Then he gave one short breath through his nose. "It's business." I gathered that. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "Then leave it there." I turned in my seat to look at him. "I'm your wife, Richard. If someone says something like that at dinner, I think I'm allowed to ask what it means." That was when his voice changed. Not louder. Worse. Colder. "Don't embarrass me by asking questions you won't understand." I stared at him. The light turned green. He drove on. What made the moment hurt was not just the insult. It was how practiced it sounded. As if he had already decided there was a category of things I did not deserve access to. Business, money, strategy, reality. As if my role was to sit beside him, wear a pleasant face, and never reach for the machinery behind the curtain. I turned toward the window and watched storefronts slide past in the dark. That night, lying awake beside him, I thought about the man who once brought me wildflowers from vacant lots. I thought about the man who now laughed when people admired my work. And for the first time, instead of telling myself he was stressed or tired or proud in a difficult way, I let a more frightening thought enter the room. Richard was not just becoming arrogant, he was becoming secretive. And whatever he was building, it was not only the company he claimed to be saving. It was an image, a performance, a life arranged so carefully from the outside that no one would think to ask what was rotting underneath. By morning, I still had no proof. Only a bruise where trust used to live. But sometimes a marriage does not begin to end with a betrayal. Sometimes it begins to end with a sentence. "Don't embarrass me by asking questions you won't understand." I did understand one thing after that. A man only talks that way when he is afraid you might finally see him clearly. After that dinner, I stopped asking Richard direct questions. Not because I trusted him again, because I didn't. When a man starts guarding simple answers, it means the truth has become expensive. So I watched instead. I watched the way he stepped outside to take calls, even in bad weather. Iowa wind could be slapping the porch swing against the railing, and Richard would still stand out there with one hand over his other ear, speaking in a low voice like the air itself might betray him. The moment I opened the back door, his tone changed. "I'll call you back," he would say, or "We'll handle it," or worse, nothing at all. Just a tight nod and a stare that made me feel like I had interrupted something I was never meant to hear. At first, I told myself it might really be business. Clients, delays, workers calling in sick, permits, materials. 100 ordinary things can make a contractor sound tense. But then the mail began to change. For years, our routine had been the same. The mail landed on the kitchen table in a small, untidy pile, and I sorted it while waiting for the kettle. Grocery flyers in one stack, church envelopes in another, bills and statements near the fruit bowl. It was such a small domestic ritual, the kind nobody notices until it disappears. One Tuesday morning, I realized there were no bank envelopes at all. The next day, none again. Then I saw Richard come in from work early, walk straight to the mailbox, and slide 2 white envelopes under his folder before stepping into the house. He saw me in the hallway and smiled too quickly. "Anything important?" I asked. "Just junk," he said. That night, after he showered, I checked the trash in his office. It felt wrong, sneaky, small. I hated myself for doing it. But what I hated more was the feeling that I was being turned into a fool inside my own house. Near the bottom of the bin, under coffee cups and folded job notes, I found strips of an envelope he had torn by hand. I pieced together what I could. Part of our address, part of a bank logo, part of the word overdue. I stood there with those scraps in my hand and felt something cold move through me. Not panic yet. Recognition. Richard was not merely stressed. He was hiding evidence. When I asked him later why he had started taking the mail first, he didn't even pretend to soften it. Because I'm tired of every envelope turning into an interrogation. That's not fair. What's not fair, he snapped, loosening his tie, is coming home from work to anxiety in human form. I stared at him. I asked one question, and I answered it. No, I said quietly. You dismissed it. He gave a short laugh. Annabelle, please. You don't understand how business works. One late payment, one delayed invoice, one lender letter. None of that means the sky is falling. The way he said lender made my chest tighten. I held his gaze. Lender. He bent to unlace his shoes. Figure of speech. That was Richard's talent. Not lying outright unless he had to. Just feeding me half sentences, altered tones, fragments designed to make me doubt my own hearing. A woman can spend years inside that kind of marriage and not realize how often she is being managed instead of loved. So I stopped trying to get truth from him. I went back to the garage. If the house had become a room full of crossed wires, the garage was still clean in one important way. Clay only did what hands did to it. No manipulation, no evasions, no polished smile overwrought. I threw mugs for 2 straight afternoons that week, then bowls, then a set of small berry dishes with a pale blue glaze that reminded me of my mother's old mixing bowls. The wheels steadied me. Centering clay requires pressure and patience at the same time. Too gentle and it wobbles. Too harsh and it collapses. I remember thinking with my hands sunk in wet clay that maybe marriage had once felt that simple to me. Maybe I had mistaken endurance for skill. A few days later, an order came in from a woman named Linda Parker. She bought a set of 4 hand-thrown mugs in a warm cream glaze with tiny pressed wildflower stems near the base. Nothing flashy. The kind of mugs you reach for on a gray morning when your hands want something kind to hold. I packed them carefully. Brown paper, bubble wrap, a handwritten thank you card tucked inside. 2 weeks later, Linda left a review. I still remember every word. She wrote that the mugs felt like something her mother might have kept in a kitchen where soup simmered all day. She wrote that one of them had become her favorite before the others were even washed. She wrote that in a world full of fast disposable things, it meant something to hold an object that felt made with patience. I sat at my kitchen table and cried over that review. Not dramatically, not loudly, just tears falling onto my reading glasses while the afternoon light shifted over the table, because that review saw me more clearly than my husband had in years. Then something unexpected happened. Linda's review brought more customers. My shop traffic ticked up. A local Iowa craft blog featured my mugs in a list of handmade comforts for fall. Then orders started coming in faster than usual. 2 mugs, a spoon rest, a custom bowl for a daughter moving into her first apartment, a set of small Thanksgiving ramekins. It was not a business empire. Richard would have laughed at the phrase, but it was real, small, steady growing. And for the first time since my mother died, I felt useful in a way that belonged to me. Of course, Richard noticed the money before he noticed the joy. One evening, I was at the sink rinsing glaze brushes when he came into the kitchen holding his phone. "Your little shop made another deposit," he said. I froze. I had once logged into my email on the family iPad to print a shipping label. I must have forgotten to sign out fully. Richard held the screen up just enough for me to know what he had seen. "It's not much," I said. He leaned against the counter, suddenly casual. Too casual. "Didn't say it was." I dried my hands. Then why mention it? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Because it adds up, doesn't it? There it was. Not pride, not support. Calculation. It covers supplies, I said. Shipping, too. Still, he said, money's money? I said nothing. He stepped closer and softened his voice in that practiced way he used when he wanted something. We're married, Annabelle. There really shouldn't be separate money. The sentence landed harder than he intended because it told me two things at once. First, he had noticed the account was separate. Second, he resented it. I kept my face still. It's just easier for bookkeeping. For pottery? Yes. He gave a small shrug. Seems unnecessary. Maybe to him it was. To me, it suddenly felt essential. That night, after he went to bed, I sat in the glow of my laptop and looked through our household accounts more carefully than I had in years. Richard had gradually taken over nearly all of it. He said it was simpler that way. That business made him more fluent with numbers, that I had enough on my plate. I let that arrangement happen 1 year at a time until I barely knew what passed through our own hands. At first, nothing jumped out except tension. Lower balances, irregular transfers, a credit payment higher than I expected. Then I saw it. A card account in both our names. I stared at the screen. I clicked again thinking I had misread it. No. Joint credit card. Opened months earlier. My pulse started to beat in my throat. I knew our cards. I knew the old Visa we had used for years. I knew the store card from the hardware chain. This one was different. A newer account. A limit I did not recognize. A balance high enough to make my stomach turn. I searched my memory for paperwork for a signature for one of those rushed moments when Richard might have handed me forms and said, just sign here. But nothing came. I got up, walked to the hall closet, and opened the file box where I kept tax records, insurance copies, old appliance manuals, and warranty papers. If I had agreed to a joint account, I would have filed something. That was the sort of woman I was. Careful, consistent, quietly organized. There was nothing. Back at the computer, I opened the account details again. My name was there beside his as plainly as if I had written it myself. For a long time, I just sat and listened to the refrigerator hum. In the bedroom, Richard was asleep on his side, breathing the deep, even breaths of a man who believed the night belonged to him. I looked at that screen and felt fear arrive in full for the first time. Because a hidden phone call is one thing, a missing envelope is another. But debt with your name on it is different. Debt crosses a threshold. Debt enters the house and sits at the table. The next morning, I asked him carefully, Richard, when did we open a new card? He was buttoning his cuff in the bathroom mirror. He did not turn around. What card? The next morning, I asked him carefully, Richard, when did we open a new card? He was buttoning his cuff in the bathroom mirror. He did not turn around. What card? The one with both our names. He gave the smallest pause. Then it's paperwork. Business related. I don't remember signing for it. Now he looked at me in the mirror. You did. His voice was flat. I don't think so. He faced me, then annoyance already rising. Annabelle, not every piece of paper in this house requires a ceremony. You signed what needed signing. I held his gaze. I want to see it. He laughed once. Sharp. For heaven's sake. It's handled. That was the moment I knew this was no misunderstanding. I didn't have proof yet, only instinct. But instinct has carried women through dangers men later insisted were imaginary. And mine was screaming now. I did not confront Richard again the next day. I wanted to. Every nerve in me wanted to walk into the kitchen, put the laptop in front of him and say, "Tell me the truth now." But by then, I understood something I had not fully admitted before. A man who can hide debt in your name can hide his face while doing it. So I stayed quiet. That silence was not surrender. It was strategy. For 2 days, I moved through the house like I always had. I made coffee. I watered the fern by the sink. I packed 2 pottery orders and answered a customer message about a custom gravy boat for Thanksgiving. I let Richard think his usual tactics were working, that I was confused, hurt, and too unsure of myself to press further. Inside, I was listening to my own memory like it was a witness. Had I signed something without reading it? Had Richard slipped papers into a stack during tax season? Had he handed me forms while I was rushing out to take my mother to a doctor's appointment? The worst part was not knowing. When someone has chipped at your confidence long enough, you start to suspect your own mind before you suspect their character. That was what Richard counted on. On the 3rd afternoon, I went into the garage to make room for more clay. Orders had picked up again, and I needed space near the back shelf where I stored glaze buckets and shipping boxes. The garage was crowded in the ordinary way. Long marriages become crowded. Half-used paint cans, holiday bins, rusted garden stakes, old cabinet knobs Richard swore he might need someday. Nothing dramatic. Just years of life stacked where life no longer fit. I pulled down 2 boxes of Christmas lights, a cracked cooler, and a folded lawn chair. Behind them sat a plastic storage tote I didn't recognize. It was gray, scuffed. No label. I knew at once it wasn't mine. Richard liked labeled bins, taxes, receipts, electrical, contracts. He was methodical when he wanted control, which meant an unlabeled box hidden behind useless junk was not forgotten. It was buried. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the lid, already knowing I was about to cross a line in my marriage I could never uncross. Then I opened it. At the top were folders. Plain manila. No company letterhead on the outside. Inside were copies of loan papers, bank statements, credit agreements, and what looked like personal guarantees connected to Scott and Sons renovations. My heart began to pound so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat down right there on the cold garage floor. I read one page, then another, then another. Several documents carried my name, Annabelle Scott. Some of them had signatures. My signature. At least that was what they were meant to be. For 1 second, I actually thought maybe Richard had been right. Maybe I had signed them and forgotten. Maybe grief had blurred whole weeks of my life. Maybe age had done what he hinted it had done, made me softer, slower, easier to misplace inside my own head. Then I looked closer. That was when the fear turned, because the signature looked like mine only from a distance. The A was wrong. I always curved mine wide at the top and let the second stroke fall lighter. This one was stiff. The final T in Scott was crossed too high. The letters leaned in a direction mine never did. It was a version of my signature drawn by someone who had seen it often, but did not live inside my hand. I put the page down and stared at it until my vision blurred. Richard had not confused me. He had copied me. I kept going through the file. There were credit lines, restructuring letters, notices from lenders, and a document referencing our home as collateral support for a business obligation. I read that line 3 times because my mind would not accept it. Our home. The yellow-sided house where I had unpacked groceries, wrapped Christmas gifts, sat with my mother through chemo nausea, and buried my face in dish towels so my daughter would not hear me cry after hard nights with Richard. That house. I pressed my fingers to my mouth. This was no hidden card anymore. No vague financial strain. No delayed invoice Richard could explain away with one cold sentence. This was deeper, bigger, more deliberate. And my name was inside it. I heard the back door open. My whole body went rigid. Richard's footsteps crossed the kitchen, then stopped. For a moment, I thought he might come straight into the garage and find me sitting there with the box open at my knees. Instead, I heard the refrigerator open. Ice. A glass. The low clink of someone who had no idea his life was beginning to split apart 15 feet away. I slid the top papers back into place, lowered the lid quietly, and shoved the tote deeper behind the boxes. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them flat against my jeans before I stood up. When I walked into the kitchen, Richard was pouring iced tea. He glanced at me. "You look flushed." "It's hot in the garage," I said. He nodded once. "Don't overdo it." That was the moment I truly saw how dangerous calm can be. He smiled at me the way he always did when he believed he still controlled the scene. He had hidden debt in my name, possibly forged signatures, put the house at risk, and there he stood drinking tea in my kitchen asking if I was overdoing it. I almost hated myself for how normal I sounded next. "I'm just tired." He accepted that. Of course he did. Richard never doubted weakness in other people, only in himself. That night, I waited until he fell asleep before I went into the hall closet and pulled out old records. Tax returns, insurance forms, library paperwork, medical releases from my mother's care. Birthday cards I had signed over the years and tucked into keepsake folders because I was the kind of woman who kept things. I spread them across the dining table and studied my own name the way a detective studies handwriting on a ransom note. The more I compared, the clearer it became. The signatures in that box were not mine. Close enough to pass if no one looked carefully. Close enough to trap me. Not mine. I should tell you that this discovery did not make me feel instantly strong. Movies lie about moments like that. Truth is messier. I felt sick. I felt old. I felt ashamed that I had spent years beside a man who thought he could use me like a forged check. And underneath all of it, I felt something even harder to admit. I felt stupid. That is what betrayal does. It makes the innocent person carry the first wave of humiliation. It tells you that because you trusted, you participated. Because you loved, you failed to inspect. Because you stayed, you helped build the stage where the lie could perform. Around midnight, Richard came into the dining room in his undershirt and stopped when he saw the papers. "What are you doing?" he asked. I forced myself not to flinch. "Looking for an old insurance number." At midnight, I couldn't sleep. His eyes moved over the table. "Not long, just long enough." Then he said, "You worry too much." I folded one paper, then another. "Maybe I should worry more." That made him still. Only for a second. Then he leaned against the doorway and gave me the expression he always used when he wanted me to feel childish. "Annabelle, you've been tense ever since your mother died. You forget things, you spiral, and then you convince yourself something ordinary is a crisis." There it was. Not comfort, not explanation. Erosion. He wanted me to doubt my memory more than he feared my anger. That realization hit me like cold water. Richard was not only lying about money, he was building a version of me that no one would trust if I spoke. A grieving woman, a confused woman, an older woman who didn't understand paperwork. I looked up at him and saw the structure all at once. The debt, the secrecy, the signatures, the way he dismissed my questions, the way he said words like burden and business and paperwork as if they belonged to some male kingdom I could never enter. He wasn't only hiding the truth. He was preparing a defense. For the first time in our marriage, I let him see nothing. Not hurt, not fear, not confusion. I just said, "I'm going to bed." He stepped aside. I gathered the papers slowly and carried them to the bedroom. But I did not sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing every creak of the house, every breath Richard took beside me, every small sound sharpened by the knowledge that the man within arm's reach had been signing my name into danger. By dawn, I knew two things. I could not ask Richard for the truth, and I could not handle this alone. The next morning, I called my niece, Emily Harris. I did it from the grocery store parking lot, not because I was being dramatic, because by then, I no longer trusted the walls of my own house. Emily was my late sister's daughter. 32, sharp-eyed, practical, and kind, in a way that never wasted time pretending ugly things were pretty. She worked as a legal assistant in Des Moines, and unlike me, she had grown up in a generation of women who checked documents before signing them and read every line men hoped they would skip. When she answered, I almost hung up. Not because I changed my mind, because saying the truth out loud would make it real. "Aunt Annabelle," she said, "you okay?" I looked through the windshield at shopping carts scattered under a pale gray sky. "No," I said, "I don't think I am." That got her attention. I told her only enough to get to the point. Hidden debt. A credit card in my name. Papers in the garage. Signatures that looked wrong. Richard insisting I had forgotten. Emily didn't interrupt. When I finished, she asked one question. "Do you still have access to the documents?" "Yes." "Then listen to me carefully," she said. "Do not confront him again. Copy everything, every page, every signature, every statement. And do not let him know you're onto him." I swallowed. "Emily, what if I'm wrong?" She answered so fast it hurt. "Then copying paperwork won't hurt anything. But if you're right, and he knows you found it, he could move money, destroy records, or start shaping a story before you do." Shaping a story. That phrase landed hard because I already knew Richard had been doing exactly that with me. Emily told me to drive to Des Moines the next day if I could. She said she would look at whatever I brought. Before hanging up, she added, "Aunt Annabelle, please hear me. Confusion is exactly what men like this rely on." Men like this. I sat there for a long moment after the call ended. Not husbands like this. Men like this. It was the first time someone had named Richard as a type instead of an exception. That afternoon, I waited until Richard left for a supplier meeting. Then I went into the garage with my phone, a portable scanner I used for Etsy tax forms, and a canvas tote bag. My hands were so cold they barely worked. I pulled out the gray bin and started copying everything. Loan agreements, credit statements, personal guarantees, documents tied to Scott and Sons renovations, pages with my name beside his, pages with signatures that looked like mine until you stared too long. I scanned every page twice. Then I photographed them too. Then I emailed copies to a new address I created that morning from the public library parking lot before coming home. It felt paranoid. It also felt necessary. By the time I finished, my back ached and my nerves were scraped raw. I put the original papers back exactly as I had found them down to the angle of the folders. Then I slid the tote bag full of copies under a bin of winter scarves in my trunk. I had just shut the garage door when Richard's truck pulled into the driveway. For 1 second, I couldn't breathe. He got out, looked tired, and came in through the side door carrying a takeout coffee and a folder. "Didn't know you were home," he said. "I was just cleaning." His eyes flicked toward the garage. That was all. But now I noticed every flicker, every calculation. He walked past me, set his folder on the counter, then stopped. "Did you move anything in the garage?" My throat tightened. "Just some boxes." "What boxes?" I shrugged. "Storage. Why?" He opened the refrigerator and kept his back to me. "I was looking for old papers earlier this week. Thought maybe you'd tossed something." There it was. Not a question. A probe. I forced my voice to stay flat. "I didn't toss anything." He nodded once, but he didn't relax. That evening, he went into the garage twice. I heard him moving things around after dinner. Heard bins scrape the floor. Heard silence stretch too long between sounds. When he came back inside, his expression was unreadable. "You sure you didn't see any paperwork?" he asked. I was at the sink, washing a glaze bowl. My pulse hammered so hard, I thought he might hear it. "No," I said. It was the first real lie I had told him in 38 years. He stood there another second. Then he said, "Must be in the truck," and walked away. I did not realize until then that fear can live in the body like fever. My knees felt weak. My jaw hurt from keeping my face composed. But underneath the fear, something else was rising. Clarity. If Richard was searching for those papers now, it meant they mattered. If they mattered, they could hurt him. The next day, I drove to Des Moines and told Richard I was going to buy glaze supplies and have lunch with an old library friend. He barely looked up from his phone when I said it. "Fine," he muttered. "Just don't make a day of it." I almost laughed, as if my time still belonged to him. Emily met me outside her office during lunch. She wore a navy blouse, low heels, and the expression of someone already preparing for trouble. We sat in her car with the tote bag between us. She went through the pages quickly at first, then more slowly. Then she stopped. "This is bad," she said. My mouth went dry. "How bad?" She looked at me. "Bad enough that I want you to pull your credit report today." I had never done that in my life. The phrase sounded like something people on television did after identity theft or divorce. Not women like me, not wives, not grandmothers who made pottery in the garage and kept birthday ribbons in kitchen drawers. Emily opened her laptop and helped me do it. The report loaded. Then the numbers appeared. I stared at them and did not understand them at first because my mind rejected the scale. There were multiple accounts tied to my name, credit cards, business-related obligations, a line of credit, and a personal guarantee attached to a commercial loan. Balances I had never seen. Dates I did not recognize. Totals that made my stomach turn so hard I thought I might be sick right there in the car. "This can't be right," I whispered. Emily did not answer right away, because it was. She pointed to one section. "This one is especially serious." I looked where she was pointing. A mailing address in Omaha, Nebraska. Not our home, not the business office. A separate address tied to one of the accounts. I frowned. "What is that?" Emily zoomed in. "Could be a forwarding address. Could be where statements were being sent. Could be a business contact. But it's not random." I kept staring at it. Omaha. Richard had no active job there. No family there. No reason I knew of for our finances to touch Nebraska at all. And suddenly, the whole thing widened. Until then, I had been thinking like a wife betrayed by money. Now I started thinking like a woman looking at a second doorway in a dark room. "What does it mean?" I asked. Emily closed the laptop halfway. "It means your husband is hiding more than debt." We sat in silence. Cars moved around us in the parking garage. Somewhere above, a horn honked twice. Ordinary life went on, while mine quietly came apart. Emily reached across the console and took my hand. "You need to protect yourself now," she said. "Copies, dates, every account, every message. And whatever you do not let him pressure you into signing anything else." I nodded, but my mind was still on Omaha. An address, a hidden place, a piece of the story Richard had never meant me to see. When I drove home that afternoon, the tote bag sat on the passenger seat, like evidence in a trial I had not yet agreed to enter. Every mile back to Cedar Rapids felt different from the miles I had driven out, because I was not driving home to my marriage anymore. I was driving back into a crime scene. I did not sleep much after that, not because of the debt, because of Omaha. Debt was terrifying, yes, But debt still lives in the same language as bills, mistakes, pressure, failure. Omaha belonged to a different language, a hidden address, a place I had never heard Richard mention, a place connected to money and silence. That was the part I could not stop turning over in my mind. 2 days later, Emily called me back. "I ran a little more on that address," she said. My hand tightened around the phone. I was in the garage trimming the base of a bowl that suddenly looked absurdly delicate against the weight of my life. "And it's a condo," she said. "Small unit. Omaha mailing records tie it to a woman named Rebecca Miller." The trimming tool slipped in my fingers. I knew that name. Not well, but enough. Rebecca Miller had done bookkeeping work for Scott & Sons Renovations on and off over the years. She was younger than me by at least 15, maybe 20 years. Sharp dresser, smooth hair, quick smile. I had seen her twice at company Christmas dinners and once at a summer barbecue Richard hosted for subcontractors and suppliers. He had introduced her casually. "Rebecca handles numbers better than half the men I hire," and I remembered the way she laughed at everything he said, as if being near him was good business. I sat down on the stool by my pottery wheel. "You think he's involved with her?" I asked. Emily exhaled softly. "I think your husband has money tied to an address that leads to a woman connected to his business. That's what I know." That was a lawyer's answer, even from a legal assistant. Careful, accurate, cold. I respected it, but I was not a lawyer. I was a wife, and wives fill silence with instinct faster than facts. After I hung up, I stood in the garage for a long time staring at nothing. I did not want to jump to conclusions. Women my age are trained not to. We are taught to be reasonable, measured, mature. Do not accuse. Do not dramatize. Do not make a fool of yourself over a suspicion. But some truths arrive in the body before they arrive on paper. I remembered Rebecca at that barbecue in a sleeveless green blouse standing a little too close to Richard while he grilled burgers. I remembered how easily he said her name. I remembered him calling her sharp, which was the sort of compliment Richard rarely gave women unless he was getting something from them. Until then, I had been trying to decide whether I was dealing with betrayal or collapse. Now I started to understand I might be dealing with both. And still life kept moving in small, humiliatingly normal ways. My shop was busier than ever. A local blog post about handmade holiday pieces had picked up traction, and Belle's Hearth Pottery started getting more orders than I could comfortably finish in a week. Women wanted matching mugs. A daughter in Minnesota ordered a custom batter bowl for her mother. Someone from Illinois bought 6 spoon rests as Christmas gifts. A widow in Ohio messaged me to ask if I could make a butter dish because the one I sold out of reminded her of the one she'd had when her husband was alive. That message stayed with me because here I was, standing in the wreckage of my marriage, shaping warm, useful objects for women, trying to make their homes feel gentle again. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. Still, I worked. I threw mugs in the mornings and packed orders in the afternoons, and each time I logged into my account and saw money land cleanly into my small, separate checking account, I felt a strange mix of gratitude and grief. Gratitude because it was mine. Grief because Richard had started noticing. He watched me more closely now. Not openly. Not enough that another person would name it. But I did. He lingered when I printed labels, asked casual questions about how many orders I had that week, picked up a finished mug and turned it over as if checking the weight of something he had already priced in his head. Then one Thursday evening, he came home with flowers. White grocery store roses. Not because it was our anniversary. Not because I'd had a hard day. Not because he'd suddenly become tender. Richard only brought flowers when he wanted to edit the atmosphere. He set them on the counter and said, "Thought the house needed cheering up." I looked at the roses, then at him. "That's unlike you." He smiled. "Maybe I'm trying." No, I thought. You're pivoting. At dinner, he was softer than usual. Asked about the pottery, complimented the roast chicken. Even laughed once low and easy as if we were returning to some earlier version of ourselves. I almost could have believed it if I had not known him so well. Or perhaps if I had not finally started knowing him correctly. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork. "There's been some cash flow pressure," he said. I kept my face still. "At the company," he nodded. "Temporary. A couple payments delayed. One client dragging things out." I said nothing. He watched me. "I've been thinking maybe this is a moment where family backs family." He nodded. "Temporary. A couple payments delayed. One client dragging things out." I said nothing. He watched me. "I've been thinking maybe this is a moment where family backs family." There it was, the real reason for the flowers. "What does that mean?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair. "It means if you've got money sitting in that little pottery account, maybe it should work for the household instead of just stacking up." I laughed before I could stop myself. Not because it was funny, because it was shameless. His expression hardened slightly. "What?" I folded my napkin. "You called it a waste of time. That was different." "No," I said. "It was honest. Not because it was funny, because it was shameless." His expression hardened slightly. "What? I folded my napkin. You called it a waste of time. That was different." "No," I said. "It was honest." He let out a breath through his nose. "Annabelle, don't be dramatic. I'm talking about a practical short-term move." "A short-term move into what?" His jaw tightened. "Into keeping things stable." There were so many things I wanted to say then. "Stable? You forged my name. Stable. There are accounts in Omaha. Stable? I found the papers you buried behind boxes in the garage. Instead, I said, 'How bad is it?' He looked at me for a second too long. 'It's manageable.' That word told me everything. Manageable is what people say when they are already drowning. The next morning, I was answering customer messages when an email popped into the shared family account Richard sometimes used for supplier communication. Usually I ignored those, but the subject line caught my eye. Final demand before account suspension. My hand froze over the mouse. The sender was a building supply company I recognized, one Richard had used for years. The message was blunt: past due balance. Repeated non-payment, 9 months outstanding, immediate action required. 9 months. I read the line twice. 9 months meant this was not temporary. 9 months meant he had been lying through entire seasons. Through dinners, holidays, church. Through every sneer he tossed at my pottery, while his own business quietly rotted underneath him. I stared at the screen and felt something inside me settle into place. Not peace, resolve. That afternoon, Richard called from the road and asked if I had transferred anything for the household yet. I said no. There was a pause. Then his voice cooled. "Annabelle, I'm trying to include you here." "No," I said. "You're trying to access my money." That silence on the other end was thick enough to touch. When he spoke again, it was softer, which made it worse. "Everything I do is for this family." I looked around the garage, the wheel, the glazed shelves, the neatly packed boxes, waiting for pickup the small life I had built in the cracks of his contempt. "No," I said quietly. "Not anymore." I hung up before he could answer. That was the moment the story changed. Up until then, I had still been reacting, watching, gathering, surviving. But now I understood something clearly. Richard did not see my pottery as silly anymore. He saw it as available, And that made it dangerous. Because when a man starts reaching for the thing he once mocked, it means he's run out of better lies. After that call, I stopped waiting for Richard to confess. Men like him do not confess. They reposition. I knew that now. So the next step had to be mine. Richard told me he had a lunch meeting with a developer on Friday. He said it in the same distracted tone he used whenever he wanted a fact to sound too ordinary for follow-up. The moment he left, I locked the front door, got in my car, and drove straight to the office of Scott & Sons Renovations. I had only been there a handful of times over the years. In the early days, I used to stop by with sandwiches or signed checks or extra folders Richard had forgotten. Later, he stopped inviting me into that part of his life. Said it was easier if I stayed focused on home. Easier for whom I understand now. The office sat in a small commercial strip on the edge of Cedar Rapids. Nothing glamorous. Frosted glass front faded signage patched asphalt in the parking lot. But when I pulled in that afternoon, something was wrong immediately. The lot was almost empty. Not quiet, empty. Dead empty. 2 cars. 1 pickup I didn't recognize. No crew trucks, no supplier van, no movement behind the windows. I parked and sat there for a second, staring at the building. Then I went inside. The front office used to smell faintly of coffee drywall dust and paper. That day, it smelled stale. A reception desk sat empty. One of the waiting chairs was missing. The framed photos of completed kitchens Richard liked to show clients were still on the wall, but one hung crooked. A printer stood dark in the corner with no paper loaded. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I stepped farther in. Mwah. 3 desks stood half cleared. File trays empty. Drawers open. A plant dead in its pot. 1 computer monitor gone, cables left dangling. It looked less like a business than a place someone had been forced to leave in a hurry. That was when I heard a voice behind me. "Mrs. Scott." I turned so fast I nearly dropped my purse. It was Carl Bennett. Carl had worked for Richard for years, site supervisor, practical man, late 50s, quiet, dependable, the kind who noticed everything and bragged about nothing. I had always liked him. He had the tired, alert face of someone who spent his life cleaning up after louder men. "Carl," I said. "I didn't know you were still here." He gave a short, uncomfortable smile. "Depends what you mean by here." That answer told me more than his face did. I looked around the office again. "What happened?" Carl glanced toward the back hallway, then lowered his voice. "You really don't know?" The shame of that moment burned hotter than I expected, because I didn't. I shook my head. Carl let out a breath and rubbed the back of his neck. "Most of the crew's gone. Office staff too. Jobs stalled out. Vendors cut us off. A couple clients are threatening legal action." Each sentence landed like a brick. I stared at him. Richard said things were tight. He didn't say. Carl gave me a look I will never forget. Not pity. Worse. Recognition. He's been saying tight for almost a year. A year. The word hit me physically. I grabbed the back of a chair. Carl kept going, maybe because once a lie cracks, people who have been forced to stand inside it too long begin talking fast. He started using deposits from new clients to cover old invoices. Then he started moving money around between jobs. Then suppliers stopped extending terms. We've had guys waiting on payment for weeks. I could barely hear anything past the rushing in my ears. "Why didn't anyone call me?" I asked. Carl looked away. "I figured he'd told you." There it was again. The assumption that wives know. The truth that many do not. I took a slow breath. Has he been talking about bankruptcy? Carl's silence answered before his mouth did. Then he said, "Yes." The room tilted. I sat down in the nearest chair because suddenly my legs didn't trust me. "Business bankruptcy?" I asked. Carl hesitated. Maybe that. Maybe personal, too. Hard to say. He's been trying to hold off creditors, but he let the sentence die. But what? He looked me straight in the eye. If your name's on any of that paperwork, you need to get legal advice fast. I felt my pulse in my hands. It is, I said quietly. Carl closed his eyes for half a second like he had hoped I'd say no. Then he pulled another chair closer and sat across from me. His voice dropped lower. Mrs. Scott, I'm going to say something I probably shouldn't, but you deserve to hear it. I braced myself. A few months back, he said Richard was in here with one of the lenders. They were arguing about signatures, guarantees, all that. And Richard said Carl stopped. What did he say? He looked miserable now. He said Annabelle signs whatever I put in front of her. For a moment, I did not feel anger. Only a blankness so deep it almost felt peaceful. Because some humiliations are too exact to hurt right away. I heard the sentence again in Richard's voice, heard the easy contempt in it, not just for my trust, but for my mind, my caution, my consent, my whole person reduced to a hand at the end of a pen. I stood up, not dramatically, not shaking, just standing, because I could not stay seated inside that sentence. Carl rose too. I'm sorry. I nodded once. Was Rebecca Miller still here? I asked. That made him blink. Rebecca. Yes. He frowned. Not for months. She was handling books part-time, then suddenly she wasn't. Richard said she moved out of state for consulting work. Consulting work? Omaha. I filed that away without reacting. Did she have access to financial records? I asked. Carl gave me a careful look now, as if realizing I knew more than I was saying. Yeah. Some. More than most. Before I could ask anything else, he walked to a filing cabinet, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a folded document. I kept this in case I needed to prove I wasn't responsible for some of the delays, he said. Vendor aging report. It's not everything, but it'll show you how long this has been going on. He handed it to me. I unfolded the pages. Supplier balances. Past due columns. Red numbers. Dates stretching back farther than I wanted to believe. Not one bad month, not one difficult season. A pattern. A slow collapse hidden under fresh drywall and confident handshakes. I looked up. Why are you giving me this? Carl's answer was simple. Because I've got daughters. That nearly broke me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was decent. A decent man had looked at what was happening and chosen not to let another woman stay blind just because her husband preferred it that way. I folded the report and placed it carefully in my purse. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding since I walked in. Is there anything left here to save? Carl glanced around the office. The dead plant, the half-cleared desks, the silence. Then he said, Not the company. I nodded. I should have left then, but I walked once through the back hall, first past Richard's office. The door stood open. Inside his desk was too clean. Not tidy, stripped. A framed award still sat on the credenza. A photo of him shaking hands with some local builder remained on the wall. But the drawers were nearly empty. File shelves bare in places. A pen tray untouched beside a missing monitor. It looked like a man preparing to tell a story about how things fell apart around him rather than because of him. That was when I understood the shape of his plan. He was not trying to save the company. He was trying to survive the collapse. And if my name was tied to those papers, he was willing to let me fall under the debris with him. I left the office without saying much else. Back in my car, I locked the doors and just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, breathing. I had come looking for confirmation. I got something worse, proof that Richard's lies were not private. Other people knew. Other people had heard him reduce me to a signature. Other people had watched the business rot while I stood at home glazing mugs he mocked and mailing out orders that turned out to be the only honest money left connected to our name. When I finally started the car, I didn't drive home right away. I drove around Cedar Rapids for nearly an hour past grocery stores and school zones and church parking lots and small brick houses where women like me were probably making dinner, sorting mail trusting men who said, "It's handled." I felt sick. I felt humiliated. But more than that, I felt awake. And once a woman wakes up inside her own life, she becomes very dangerous to the man who built it on her silence. That night, Richard cooked dinner. Not reheated leftovers. Not takeout in nicer plates. Cooked. When I walked in from the garage, the kitchen lights were dimmed, the table was set, and there were 2 candles burning in the middle, like we were a couple in a commercial for second chances. He had opened a bottle of red wine we'd been saving for no reason at all. He'd even made roast chicken with rosemary and lemon, the same dish he used to cook when we were first married, and still pretending effort meant devotion. I stood in the doorway and stared at the scene. For one weak, foolish second, my body remembered the man I had once loved before my mind caught up with the man in front of me. "You're early," he said, smiling, as if surprise were part of the plan. "I live here," I said. He gave a short laugh. "Sit down. I didn't want to." But I did, not because I trusted him, because by then every conversation felt like evidence. He poured wine into my glass before I touched the bottle. "I thought we needed one quiet evening," he said. "No tension, no suspicion. Just us." The word suspicion nearly made me laugh. Instead, I picked up my napkin and laid it across my lap. "What do you want, Richard?" His smile held a second too long. "Can't a husband make dinner for his wife without being interrogated?" "No." That sharpened his eyes. Only for a beat. Then he softened again, trying a different angle. "Things have been hard. I know that. I've been under pressure. I haven't always handled it well." That was as close to confession as he was willing to come, language with all the shape of remorse and none of the content. I said nothing. He took a sip of wine. "The company's hit a rough patch." "A rough patch," I repeated. "Yes." "How rough?" He set down his glass carefully. "Temporary cash flow problems. A few delayed receivables. Some overreaction from vendors." Overreaction. 9 months unpaid, and that was the word he chose. I looked at him and saw how practiced he was at resizing disaster until it fit inside something a wife could be expected to tolerate. "And what does that have to do with dinner?" I asked. He leaned back. "It has to do with partnership, marriage, standing together when life gets ugly." I felt my stomach go cold. There it was. Not love. Collection. He folded his hands on the table. "I need you to transfer the money from your pottery account into our joint account." He said it gently. That was the ugliest part. As if he were asking me to pass the salt. I looked at him for a long moment. All of it. "For now." "For now," I repeated. He nodded. "It will help stabilize things." I almost admired the nerve. Almost. Instead, I asked, "How much trouble are we in?" His face changed. "Not fully, just enough." "That's not the point." "It is, to me." He sighed, the patient sigh of a man pretending he is burdened by other people's inability to be easy prey. "Annabelle, this is exactly what I'm talking about. I'm trying to solve a problem and you want to turn it into drama." I felt something inside me go still. Not fear. Decision. I set down my fork. "I'm not transferring the money." He blinked once. What I said no. The room went quiet, except for the small hiss of the candles. Richard leaned forward slowly. I don't think you understand. No, I said. I understand very well. His jaw tightened. That account is marital money. No, it's money I earned. His eyes hardened. From playing in clay? There it was again. The contempt. Familiar. Automatic. Like breathing. I looked him straight in the face. Yes, from the hobby you laughed at. The one that's been paying for shipping groceries, electricity, and half the things in this house while you were lying to me. His expression froze. That sentence landed. He knew then that I knew more than he wanted. How much did Carl tell you? He asked. So that was his first instinct. Not denial. Containment. I didn't answer. Richard sat back in his chair and exhaled hard through his nose. The softness was gone now. So were the flowers and the wine and the theater of being misunderstood. All that remained was the man beneath it. You have no idea what it takes to carry a business, he said. No idea what I've been managing. Managing, I repeated. Is that what you call using my name? His eyes flashed. Watch your tone. I almost smiled at that. 38 years. And still, when cornered, he reached for authority. My tone, I said quietly. You've hidden debt. You've hidden mail. You've hidden accounts. And now you're asking for the only clean money left in this house. He slammed his hand on the table. The wine glasses rattled. Don't talk to me like I'm some kind of criminal. I held his gaze. Then stop acting like one. That did it. His face changed in a way I had seen only a few times in our marriage. Not violence exactly, but the hot blankness of a man who feels his control slipping and cannot bear the humiliation of it. He stood up so suddenly his chair scraped hard across the floor. You are being unbelievably selfish, he snapped. You sit in that garage making little cups while I'm trying to keep this family alive. I stood too. No, I said. You were trying to keep your image alive. His voice rose. That little clay shop won't save you. I heard myself answer before I had fully thought it through. It already has. He laughed once, sharp and ugly. From what? From depending on you. Silence. Real silence this time. Not the quiet between lines in a marriage. The silence after a blow lands cleanly. Richard stared at me as if I had stepped outside a role he had written too long ago to imagine losing. Wife, supporter, buffer, signature. He didn't know what to do with a woman who had started speaking in full sentences. Then his eyes moved past me, to the sideboard. That was where I had placed a pottery piece 3 months earlier. A tall, cream-colored vase with tiny blue cornflowers carved into the side. I had made it after my mother died. It was the first thing I'd ever created that felt less like an object and more like grief made visible. I had never told Richard that, but he knew I cared about it. You don't have to understand tenderness to know where someone keeps it. He walked to it. Don't, I said. He turned one hand already on the vase. Richard! He looked me dead in the face, then let it fall. The sound was violent. Clay shattered across the hardwood in a burst of pale pieces and blue glaze. For 1 second, I could not move. I just stared at the wreckage where something sacred had been a heartbeat earlier. He looked almost calm after he did it. That was the part I will never forget. Not rage, choice. He had chosen the thing that would hurt most, because hurting me was in that moment the only power he still felt he had. I dropped to my knees before I even knew I was moving. My hands shook as I reached toward the broken pieces. One shard was still painted with the tiny blue flowers I had carved while thinking of my mother's kitchen curtains. Another held the curved edge of the rim I had sanded smooth with such care. Behind me, Richard said, "Maybe now you'll understand what real loss looks like." I did not cry. I should tell you that because people expect tears in a moment like that. But I didn't cry. Something colder happened instead. As I picked up the pieces, my fingers touched the back corner of the sideboard, where years earlier I had tucked a small black USB drive into a loose seam beneath the drawer liner. I had hidden it there after one hectic Christmas season when I was afraid I'd lose customer photos and Etsy records if my laptop crashed. It held product images, shipping logs, tax drafts, scanned forms, years of proof from the little business Richard mocked. I felt the edge of it under my fingertips, and in that instant, kneeling in front of the wreckage he had made, I understood something with total clarity. He had just reminded me where my protection was. I stood up slowly, one sharp piece of pottery still in my hand. Richard must have seen something change in my face because he took one step back. Good. For the first time in a very long time, he should have. I set the shard on the table. Then I said very quietly, "I'm done." He gave a humorless laugh. "You're not going anywhere." He was wrong. What he didn't know yet was that he had already broken the wrong thing. Not the vase. The illusion that I would stay and let him finish destroying me. I waited until Richard went upstairs. Then I moved. Not fast. Fast makes noise. Fast makes mistakes. I picked up the largest pieces of the broken vase and placed them on the dining table one by one, as if I were laying out evidence. My hands were steady now. That frightened me a little. There is a kind of calm that comes only after a person has been pushed past grief. Richard had broken the vase my hands made for my mother. But he had also given me permission to stop pretending this was still a marriage. I listened. Water ran upstairs. A drawer opened. A floorboard creaked. Then the bathroom fan started. Good. That gave me a few minutes. I crossed to the sideboard, lifted the drawer liner, and reached into the seam beneath it. My fingers touched the small black USB drive again. I pulled it free and closed my fist around it so tightly the edges bit into my palm. That little drive was nothing impressive. Cheap plastic. No label. Something I had bought in a pack of 3 at an office supply store years earlier. But inside, it was the history of Belle's hearth pottery. Photos of every mug, bowl, vase, and spoon rest I had ever listed. Scanned receipts for clay and glaze. Etsy order reports. Shipping labels. Tax worksheets, customer emails, bank statements from my separate account, copies of forms with my real signature. Even old library paperwork I had scanned once because I hated clutter but loved records. Richard had called my hobby useless, yet my useless hobby had kept better records than his entire collapsing company. I slipped the USB into the inside pocket of my purse. Then I went to the bedroom quietly and packed without turning on the overhead light. 2 changes of clothes, medication, phone charger, my mother's wedding ring from the small dish on my dresser, the file folder I had hidden inside an old quilting magazine, the vendor report Carl gave me, the printed credit report Emily helped me pull. I did not pack sentimental things. That is something people do not understand until they have to leave quickly. When the moment comes, the heart wants photo albums, keepsakes, letters, china, Christmas ornaments. But fear teaches you what matters. Documents, medicine, money, proof. I had my hand on the bedroom doorknob when Richard came out of the bathroom. His hair was damp. His face had returned to that controlled blankness I knew too well. "Where are you going?" he asked. I did not turn around fully. "To Emily's. At this hour?" "Yes." He looked past me at the small overnight bag in my hand. "You're being ridiculous." I almost smiled. Ridiculous. Dramatic. confused, selfish. He kept reaching for old words, not realizing they had lost their hooks. "I'm leaving for tonight," I said. His voice dropped. "Annabelle," that tone used to stop me, not because it was loud, but because it carried warning beneath my name. It did not stop me now. He stepped closer. "You walk out that door, don't expect me to fix what happens next." I looked at him then. Really looked. This man had hidden debt in my name, possibly forged my signature, watched his business rot concealed, another address reached for my money, and smashed the one piece of pottery that held my mother's memory. And still, he believed the threat was that he might stop protecting me. "You already stopped fixing things a long time ago," I said. Then I walked out. He did not follow me to the car. That told me something too. Richard did not want a scene where neighbors might see. Control mattered to him more than love, image more than truth. Always. I drove to Emily's house in Des Moines with both hands locked on the wheel. It was nearly midnight. The road was dark, the kind of flat Midwestern dark that makes every pair of headlights look like a decision coming toward you. Halfway there, my phone rang. "Richard." I let it go to voicemail. It rang again, then the messages started. First soft. "Annabelle, come home. We need to talk like adults." Then wounded. "I can't believe you would abandon me when things are hard." It rang again, then the messages started. First soft. "Annabelle, come home. We need to talk like adults." Then wounded. "I can't believe you would abandon me when things are hard." Then angry. "You have no idea what you're doing." Then cruel. "You think those little mugs make you independent? You're going to learn fast." I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and kept driving. By the time I reached Emily's house, my body felt hollow. She opened the door before I knocked twice. She wore sweatpants and a cardigan, her hair pulled up messily, but her eyes were sharp. She looked at my face, then at the bag in my hand. "He did something," she said. I nodded. "He broke my mother's vase." Emily's expression changed. Not surprise. Anger. Quiet, immediate anger. "Come in." I stepped over the threshold and felt my knees nearly give way. Emily took my bag, locked the door behind me, and guided me to the kitchen table. She made tea I didn't drink. Then I pulled the USB from my purse and placed it between us. "This has everything from my shop," I said. "Maybe signatures too, tax records, photos, orders. I don't know what matters." Emily picked it up like it was fragile. "All of it might." Within minutes, she had her laptop open. We copied the USB to her computer, then to a cloud folder, then to another drive. Emily was methodical, fast, no comforting speeches, just action. It helped more than comfort would have. When the files opened, I saw my life arranged in folders. Mugs 2021, holiday orders. Tax 2022, signature scans, craft fair booths. Receipts, clay glaze kiln. Emily clicked through the signature folder first. There were scanned tax forms, Etsy verification documents, my old library retirement papers, and banking forms from the account I had opened for Belle's Hearth Pottery. All with my true signature. She zoomed in. Then she pulled up the photos I had taken of the loan papers from Richard's hidden box. Side by side, even I could see it clearly now. The fake signatures tried to imitate mine, but they were heavier, more forced. Too careful where mine was fluid, too stiff where mine lifted naturally. Emily sat back. "Aunt Annabelle, this is important." I swallowed. "Important enough?" "Important enough to show a lawyer first thing tomorrow." That was how I met Patricia Grant. Emily called in a favor before 8 the next morning. Patricia was a bankruptcy and financial fraud attorney in Des Moines, with silver hair cut to her chin and a voice so calm it made panic feel inefficient. Her office had no soft lighting, no decorative fountain, no false warmth. Just books, files, and a conference table where excuses went to die. She listened to my story without interrupting. That alone nearly broke me. For once, no one told me I was confused. No one told me I worried too much. No one told me business was too complicated for me to understand. When I finished, Patricia to understand. When I finished, Patricia looked at the documents, then at me. "Mrs. Scott," she said, "I'm going to be very direct. You need to assume your husband may file bankruptcy soon. You also need to assume he may try to frame these debts as shared obligations." Looked at the documents, then at me. "Mrs. Scott," she said, "I'm going to be very direct. You need to assume your husband may file bankruptcy soon. You also need to assume he may try to frame these debts as shared obligations." My stomach dropped. "Can he do that?" "He can try," she said. "Trying is not the same as succeeding." Those words steadied me. Patricia reviewed everything: the hidden loan documents, the credit report, the vendor aging report from Carl, the suspicious Omaha address, the emails from suppliers, and my pottery records. She spent extra time on my Etsy statements and craft fair receipts. Then she tapped one page with her pen. "This is useful." I leaned forward. "A mug order. A time-stamped business record," she corrected. "You have dates, locations, customer communications, payment trails, and shipping records. This is clean documentation." She opened another folder. Craft fair photos. There I was, standing behind a booth at a community arts fair in Iowa City, wearing a blue sweater, smiling awkwardly beside rows of mugs. There were booth receipts, parking passes, emails from organizers, even customer photos Linda Parker had sent me afterward. Patricia compared those dates to one of the loan documents, then another. Her expression shifted. "This loan was opened the same day you were at that fair." Emily leaned in. "She couldn't have signed in person." "Not if we can verify time and location," Patricia said. I stared at the screen. A photo I once thought made me look old and tired was now proof I had been somewhere else when my name was placed on a debt. My silly little booth, my wasted time mugs, my clay-covered hands, they were becoming an alibi. Patricia looked at me over her glasses. "Your hobby may have done more than earn separate income," she said. "It may help prove you were not present for some of these signatures." I pressed my hand to my mouth. For the first time since opening that gray box in the garage, I felt something close to hope. Not happiness, hope. There is a difference. Happiness is light. Hope is heavier. It has to fight through dirt first. Patricia gave me instructions before I left. "Do not sign anything. Do not transfer money. Do not speak to Richard alone about finances. Preserve every message. Gather every pottery record from the last 3 years. Make a list of people who saw me at fairs, shipped supplies to me, bought from me, or knew I handled my own shop." When she finished, she closed the folder and said, "Your husband thought he was using a woman no one would question." I looked down at my hands. The same hands Richard had mocked. The same hands that had shaped mugs, packed boxes, signed receipts, photographed inventory, and held my life together when he was busy tearing it apart. Patricia's voice softened slightly. "He may have underestimated the wrong woman." That sentence stayed with me, because for years Richard had called my pottery a waste of time. But sitting in that office, surrounded by the proof my own hands had created, I finally understood the truth. It was not a waste. It was a record of my survival. Richard called me 27 times in 2 days. I counted because Patricia told me to keep records. That was the strange thing about my life then. Pain became documentation. Fear became screenshots. Every cruel voicemail, every text message, every threat wrapped in apology, nothing was only emotional anymore. It was evidence. The first messages were soft. Annabelle, come home. We can fix this. Then wounded. I can't believe you'd run to your niece instead of talking to your husband. Then practical. The house is at risk if you keep acting like this. Then ugly. No one is going to believe you didn't know. You signed plenty of things over the years. I saved them all. Patricia had been clear. Do not respond emotionally, she said. Do not argue. Do not explain. And absolutely do not meet him alone. That sounded simple in her office. It was not simple at 2 a.m, sitting in Emily's guest room, staring at the glow of my phone while Richard's name flashed again and again. 38 years of marriage do not turn off because a lawyer says so. Part of me still heard the younger Richard in every call. The man who brought wildflowers. The man who once held my hand during my mother's first surgery. The man I had built a house with, raised a daughter, with buried parents beside. That was the cruelest part. Betrayal does not erase love immediately. It poisons it slowly. By the 3rd day, Richard changed tactics. He sent a photo of our house. Just the front porch, the yellow siding, the white rail I had painted myself one spring, after my mother said the house looked tired. Beneath the photo, he wrote, "This is what you're willing to lose." I sat on Emily's bed and felt the breath leave me. Because the answer was no. I was not willing to lose it. I loved that house. I loved the kitchen window over the sink. I loved the small patch of lilies by the mailbox. I loved the mark on the hallway wall where we had measured our daughter Grace's height year after year, until she rolled her eyes and told us she was grown. I loved the garage too, even with its dust and cold floor, because it was where I had rebuilt pieces of myself no one else noticed were missing. Richard knew that. That was why he sent the photo, not because he cared what the house meant to me, because he knew what pressure point to press. I showed the message to Patricia. She read it, then looked at me calmly. He is trying to make you choose between memory and survival. My eyes burned. What if I lose both? Then we fight to make sure you don't lose yourself. It was the kind of sentence I might have dismissed as dramatic a month earlier. Now it felt like a rope thrown across dark water. Patricia scheduled a meeting with Richard's attorney for the following week. Not court yet. Not a full hearing. A formal legal conference to address the questionable debts, the alleged joint obligations, and the documents carrying my signature. Richard arrived looking exactly like the man I had once believed in. That was what made me angry. He wore a navy suit, polished shoes, and the silver watch Grace had given him for Father's Day. His hair was neatly combed. He had shaved. He looked tired, but in a dignified way, like a hard-working husband wronged by chaos and an unreasonable wife. I knew that performance. I had lived inside it. His attorney was a narrow-faced man named Martin Keller. Polite voice, careful eyes. He shook Patricia's hand, nodded at Emily, and glanced at me with the mild expression men use when they think a woman's emotions are the main obstacle in the room. Richard looked at me and sighed. Not sadly, strategically. "Annabelle," he said, "this has gone far enough." I felt Emily's hand touch my arm under the table. A reminder. Do not answer him. Patricia spoke instead. All communication can go through counsel. Richard's jaw tightened. Martin Keller opened a folder. My client's position is that Mrs. Scott was aware of the financial obligations connected to Scott & Sons renovations and signed relevant documents as part of routine marital and business planning. Routine. That word nearly made me laugh. Apparently, a husband hiding debts and a wife discovering forged-looking signatures was routine if a man in a suit said it calmly enough. Patricia slid a stack of papers across the table. Our position, Apparently, a husband hiding debts and a wife discovering forged-looking signatures was routine if a man in a suit said it calmly enough. Patricia slid a stack of papers across the table. Our position, she said, is that multiple signatures attributed to Mrs. Scott are questionable, that she was not properly informed of the obligations, and that there may have been concealment of financial statements and creditor communications. Richard leaned forward. Questionable. For God's sake, Annabelle signed things all the time. There it was again. Annabelle signs whatever I put in front of her. Carl's words echoed in my head. Patricia did not look at Richard. She looked at his attorney. We have known signature samples from bank documents, tax filings, prior employment records, and business filings related to Mrs. Scott's separate pottery shop. We also have time-stamped records placing her elsewhere on dates attached to some of these disputed documents. Martin Keller's expression shifted. Just a little, but I saw it. He had not expected that. Richard looked at me then, really looked. For the first time since I left, I saw something like alarm move behind his eyes. Not guilt, alarm. There is a difference. Guilt worries about harm done. Alarm worries about being caught. Patricia continued calm as rain on stone. We also have creditor communication suggesting the company's financial distress predates what Mr. Scott represented to his wife. Richard snapped. That report was stolen. Patricia turned one page. It was provided by a former employee. He went pale with anger. Carl. He said the name like a curse. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched him make my case for me. Every flash of temper, every interruption, every little attempt to control the room showed what I had been living with behind closed doors. Then Martin Keller said something that changed everything. He looked at Patricia and asked, "Are you also alleging misconduct connected to the consulting account?" Patricia paused, only for half a second, but it was enough. I looked at her, then at Richard. Richard went still. Not angry now. Still. What consulting account? I asked before I could stop myself. Patricia's eyes flicked toward me, not scolding, but warning. Martin Keller realized his mistake immediately. We can address that later. No, Patricia said. We can address it now. Please identify the account. Richard's face had changed color. Martin closed his folder slightly. I think we should take a brief recess. Patricia did not move. If funds from Scott & Sons renovations were diverted to an account not disclosed in the materials provided, we will be requesting complete records. Richard pushed back from the table. This is ridiculous. His voice was too loud, too fast. Martin touched his arm. Richard. That small gesture told me everything. His own lawyer was trying to stop him from speaking. I looked at Richard and felt a sick clarity settle over me. The hidden credit cards, the forged-looking signatures, Omaha, Rebecca Miller, and now a consulting account his own attorney had mentioned by accident. The room seemed to narrow. I had thought we were there to prove what Richard had done to me. Now I understood we might also find out where the money had gone. The meeting ended shortly after that. Martin Keller said they needed time to review Patricia's concerns. Richard refused to look at me as he left. That more than his anger confirmed what I already knew. Richard was not afraid of losing me. He was afraid of records. Outside the building, I stood beside Emily in the cold air, trying to breathe. Patricia came out last, carrying her briefcase. What is a consulting account? I asked. She looked at me with the careful expression of someone deciding how much truth a person can carry at once. It may be nothing, she said. I knew enough by then to hear what that meant. It was not nothing, she continued. But if money was moved through a separate account, especially to someone connected to the business, it could matter a great deal. I thought of Rebecca Miller's name tied to Omaha. My stomach twisted. Could it help prove he was hiding things? I asked. Patricia looked straight at me. Yes. That one word hit harder than any long explanation could. On the drive back to Emily's house, I watched the fields pass in muted winter colors and thought about how many years Richard had told me I did not understand business. Maybe he was right in one way. I did not understand the kind of business that needed hidden accounts, silent wives' forged-looking signatures, and another woman's address in another state. But I understood something now that mattered more. Richard had made one mistake. He believed I was too small to follow the paper trail. He forgot I was a woman who had spent years making fragile things survive fire. Patricia filed the request for records the next morning. Richard did not know it yet, but the room had shifted. For years he had controlled the story by controlling what I could see. Bank statements disappeared before I touched the mail. Calls moved outside. Folders hid behind garage boxes. Numbers were wrapped in words like temporary, complicated, and business. But legal requests are different. They do not care about tone. They ask for dates, accounts, transfers, names. And names are where liars start to bleed. It took 9 days for the first batch of records to arrive. 9 days of Richard calling less and texting more. 9 days of him trying different masks. One message said, "You're letting strangers turn you against me." Another said, "Rebecca has nothing to do with this." That was interesting, because I had not mentioned Rebecca to him. I showed the message to Patricia. She read it twice, then looked up. He volunteered that. Yes. Good. That was all she said. Good. It is strange how a single careless sentence can become a door. The records came in pieces, bank summaries first, then partial business ledgers, then transaction details tied to what Martin Keller had called the consulting account. Patricia spread everything across the conference table with the quiet focus of a surgeon. Emily sat beside me. I held a notebook because Patricia had told me to write down anything I recognized. At first, the numbers blurred together. Transfers, withdrawals, vendor payments, late fees, advances, deposits. It all looked like a language designed to punish women who trusted their husbands. Then Patricia placed one sheet in front of me. "Do you recognize this payee?" she asked. "Rebecca Miller, Consulting, LLC. My throat went dry. There it was. Not a suspicion. Not an Omaha address. Not my imagination. A name. Patricia tapped the line with her pen. Payments were made from Scott & Sons renovations to this entity for more than 2 years. "How much?" Emily asked. Patricia did not answer immediately. That pause told me to prepare. Then she gave the number. I will not repeat the exact amount because even now it makes my hands feel cold. But it was enough to change everything. Enough to cover supplier balances. Enough to keep employees paid longer. Enough to explain why Richard had been desperate for my pottery money while pretending the company had only hit a rough patch. I stared at the page. "Consulting," I said. Patricia's face stayed calm. That is how it was categorized. What did she consult on? That is the question. I knew the answer before anyone said it. Rebecca had been the bookkeeper. The woman who handled numbers better than half the men Richard hired. The woman tied to an Omaha address. The woman Richard had claimed had nothing to do with this before anyone accused her. I felt no sudden explosion of jealousy. That surprised me. Maybe because by then, the betrayal was already too large for one emotion. It was not just another woman. It was debt in my name, a house at risk, employees unpaid, vendors lied to. My work mocked while my money was targeted. Rebecca was not the whole wound. She was the proof the wound had another depth. 2 days later, Rebecca called me. I did not recognize the number, so I almost let it go. Something made me answer. Is this Annabelle Scott? Her voice was smoother than I remembered. Yes. A pause. This is Rebecca Miller. I went still. I was sitting at Emily's kitchen table sorting printed Etsy invoices into date order. My first instinct was to hang up. Patricia had told me not to engage with anyone tied to the case without warning her, but Rebecca spoke quickly. I'm not calling to fight. I said nothing. I know you probably think certain things. Rebecca? I said, surprised by how steady I sounded. I do not have to think anymore. I have records. That silenced her. Only for a moment. Then her voice sharpened. Richard told me you knew more than you're pretending. There it was again. His defense. Make me seem forgetful. Make me seem dishonest. Make me part of the mess. I picked up my pen and started writing the date, time, and number on a blank sheet of paper. What did Richard tell you? I asked. He said the marriage was over in every way except paperwork. I felt Emily look up from across the table. Rebecca continued. He said he was going to leave once the finances were cleaned up. Cleaned up? I almost laughed. Men have a gift for making destruction sound like housekeeping. He said you didn't understand the business, she said. That you never wanted to know details. I wrote that down too. What else? Rebecca exhaled. He said you'd be fine, that you had the house, that you had your little pottery thing, that you had nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. The words went through me slowly like a knife that had time. I looked around Emily's kitchen, at my folders, at my printed orders, at the mug I had made myself, the one with the small thumb mark near the handle, at the life I was trying to rescue from a man who had decided I was empty enough to sacrifice. Nothing to lose. I had a life, I said. Rebecca did not answer. Maybe she had expected screaming. Maybe tears. Maybe an older wife begging a younger woman for details. I gave her none of that. Why are you calling? I asked. Her voice lowered. Because Richard is trying to make it sound like I handled things I didn't handle. He's telling people I moved money wrong, that I misunderstood instructions, that the consulting payments were legitimate but poorly documented. And were they? Silence? Then, some were for bookkeeping, some. Another pause. I'm sending you something, she said. No. Send it to my attorney. I don't have her information. I gave her Patricia's office email and nothing else. Before hanging up, Rebecca said one more thing. He was going to use your pottery money. My grip tightened around the pen. I know. No, she said. I mean, he planned it. He wrote it down. I stopped breathing. What? There's an email. He said if he could get you emotional about the house money from Belle's hearth, could keep creditors quiet another month. For a second, I could not speak. Because hearing your life reduced to strategy is different from suspecting it. My grief, my home, my loyalty, my craft. All of it had been a set of buttons Richard believed he could push. Send it to Patricia, I said. Then I hung up. The email arrived that afternoon. Patricia opened it while Emily and I sat across from her. I watched her face as she read. Her expression did not change much, but her jaw tightened. Read it, I said. Patricia hesitated. It will hurt. I know. So she summarized it. Richard had written to Rebecca weeks earlier. He said creditors were pressing. He said the joint account was nearly dry. He said I was attached to the house and could be convinced that refusing to help meant losing it. Then came the line that made my stomach turn. Belle's hearth money might keep them quiet for another month, if Annabelle stops acting sentimental about her little shop. Little shop? Not hobby now, shop. When he mocked it, it was a hobby. When he needed it, it was money. I sat very still. Emily reached for my hand, but I pulled it back gently. Not because I didn't want comfort, because I needed to feel the full shape of my anger. For years, Richard had treated my pottery as proof I was wasting time. But behind my back, he had calculated how long that wasted time could buy him. That was when the last tender thread inside me snapped. Not loudly, cleanly. Patricia printed the email and placed it in the growing file. "This helps," she said. I nodded. It did help. That was the bitter miracle of betrayal. The thing that broke your heart could also become the thing that proved you were right to leave. I drove back to Emily's house that evening and sat alone in the guest room with my notebook. I wrote down every sentence I could remember from Richard over the years. At your age, playing with dirt, bowls nobody needs, little clay shop, waste of time. Then beneath them, I wrote another list. Receipts, orders, bank records, signatures, photos, witnesses, proof. I looked at both lists for a long time. One was the story Richard told about me. The other was the truth my hands had built. And for the first time, I understood that the fight ahead was not only about debt bankruptcy or even forged signatures. It was about whose version of my life would survive. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in a federal building that smelled like old paper-polished floors and other people's consequences. I remember that smell because I was trying not to think about my hands. They would not stop trembling. Patricia noticed before I did. She slid a yellow legal pad toward me and placed a pen on top of it. "Hold this," she said quietly. "It gives your hands something to do." So I did. Across the room, Richard sat beside Martin Keller. He looked smaller than he had at our kitchen table. Not weak, not humble, just compressed. His suit was still good, his shoes still polished, but his face had the gray cast of a man who had spent too many nights calculating how much truth could be survived. He did not look at me. That helped. If he had, I might have remembered too much. The man who kissed my forehead. The man who once fixed the porch light in the rain. The man who had called my mother Mom near the end because she liked it. Betrayal is never one clean thing. It drags the good memories into court too and makes them sit beside the evidence. The matter before the court was not the full end of everything. Patricia had explained that. It was an important hearing tied to Richard's bankruptcy filings, disputed debts, questionable signatures, and whether certain obligations could be treated as shared or challenged as fraudulently obtained. To me, it felt like Judgment Day. The room was not dramatic. No shouting jury, no gasps. Just a judge, attorney's documents, and a silence that made every page turn sound loud. Richard's side went first. Martin Keller stood and did what lawyers do when facts are ugly. He made them sound like weather. He talked about economic pressure in the construction sector. He talked about cash flow disruptions. He mentioned rising materials costs, delayed client payments, and good faith efforts to preserve the business. Good faith. I looked down at my legal pad and wrote those words. Then I crossed them out so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. Richard sat very still while his attorney painted him as a hard-working man caught in a storm. Not reckless, not deceptive, just overwhelmed. A husband trying to save a company, a home, a future. Then Martin said the sentence Patricia had warned me would come. Mrs. Scott was aware of the company's financial pressures and participated in routine signing of household and business-related documents. Participated. That word made my stomach turn, because participation implies choice. And choice was exactly what Richard had taken. Patricia stood slowly. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Your Honor, we dispute that characterization. Then she began. Not with emotion, with order. First the credit report showing accounts I had not recognized, then the hidden documents I had copied from the garage, then known samples of my true signature bank forms, library retirement documents, Etsy verification records, tax filings from Bell's Hearth Pottery, then the disputed signatures, side by side enlarged. Even from where I sat, I could see the difference. The forged-looking signatures were too stiff, too controlled, too careful. My real signature had small imperfections because real hands move with habit, not imitation. Richard stared at the table. Patricia continued. She brought up the craft fair dates, the booth receipt from Iowa City, the time-stamped photo of me standing behind rows of mugs, the email from the event organizer confirming my attendance, the payment log showing a customer purchase made in person at the very hour one disputed loan document supposedly bore my signature elsewhere. I heard a small shift in the room. Not a gasp. Something subtler. Attention. For years, Richard had mocked those craft fairs. The folding tables, the handmade signs, the old women touching mugs and saying, "This feels nice in my hand." He had called it quaint, silly, harmless. Now those same little records stood in a federal room and contradicted him. Patricia then introduced the vendor aging report. Carl provided the email from Rebecca and the consulting account payments. Richard's face hardened at Rebecca's name. The judge asked a few questions. Patricia answered each one with dates. That was her power. Richard had drama. Patricia had dates. Then came the handwriting expert. I had never met him before that morning. He was calm, precise, and almost boring in the way people are when they know their work is strong. He explained pressure letter formation, rhythm, and natural variation. He explained that imitation often produces hesitation, especially at the beginning and end of strokes. Then he said it plainly. In my opinion, multiple question signatures were not written by Mrs. Scott. The words entered me slowly. Not written by Mrs. Scott. For months, Richard had tried to make me question my memory. Not written by Mrs. Scott. He had hinted grief made me forgetful. Not written by Mrs. Scott. He had built a version of me as confused, emotional, unreliable. Not written by Mrs. Scott. I felt Emily's hand close over mine. This time, I let her hold it. Then Richard made his mistake. Patricia had just finished questioning the expert when Martin leaned toward Richard and whispered something. Richard shook his head sharply. The judge noticed. Mr. Scott. Patricia had just finished questioning the expert when Martin leaned toward Richard and whispered something. Richard shook his head sharply. The judge noticed. Mr. Scott, the judge said, you will have an opportunity through counsel. Richard sat back, but his control was already fraying. A few minutes later, when Patricia referred to my pottery business as a documented independent source of income, Richard muttered loud enough for the room to hear. It was just a hobby. The room went still. I looked at him then, for the first time all morning. There he was. Not the victim. Not the businessman. Not the husband under pressure. The man who broke my vase. The man who laughed at my work. The man who wanted my money only after his lies ran dry. Patricia turned slightly toward me. She did not tell me to speak, but I knew. The judge looked over his glasses. Mrs. Scott, do you wish to respond? My body felt far away as I stood. My voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected. Yes, Your Honor. I looked at Richard, then at the judge. For years, my husband called my work a waste of time. He said I made bowls nobody needed. He said I played with dirt. He said I didn't understand business. I swallowed. But every receipt from that work was honest. Every order was real. Every photo had a date. Every customer paid into an account he did not control. While he was hiding debts, that hobby was the only clean record left in our house. Richard's face tightened. I kept going. He used my trust like a signature stamp. He let me believe I was forgetful. He made me feel small so I would not ask questions. And when I refused to hand over the money from my shop, he broke the vase I made to remember my mother. My voice almost broke there, but it did not. I looked straight at him. No, I said. It was not just a hobby. It was the only honest work left in our house. No one spoke. For once, Richard had no instant answer, no cold correction, no dismissive laugh, no sentence designed to make me smaller. The judge did not rule on everything that day. Legal matters rarely end as cleanly as stories do. But certain things became clear. Some debts would be separated for further review. The questioned signatures would be investigated. My pottery account and records would not be casually swallowed into Richard's version of shared obligation. The consulting account would face scrutiny, and Richard's image, the one he had built so carefully with suits, handshakes, and lies, cracked in public. That mattered more than I expected. Not because I wanted revenge, because truth spoken aloud changes the air. After the hearing, Richard passed me in the hallway. For a moment, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he said under his breath, "You enjoyed that." I looked at him, and for the first time in 38 years, I did not explain myself. I did not defend my heart. I did not soften the truth to make him comfortable. I simply said, "No, Richard, I survived it." Then I walked away. After the hearing, people kept asking me if I felt relieved. I never knew how to answer. Relief sounds light, clean, like setting down a heavy grocery bag after carrying it too long. What I felt was heavier than that. I felt as if someone had opened every window in a house filled with smoke, and only then did I realize how long I had been breathing poison. Richard did not go to jail that day. Life rarely gives justice in one neat scene. But things changed quickly after that. Patricia told me some of the debts tied to my name would be separated for further review. The signatures questioned by the expert could not simply be waved away as marital paperwork. Creditors were forced to look more carefully. Richard's bankruptcy became messier for him, not cleaner. The consulting account drew attention. Rebecca's email became part of the record. Carl's vendor report mattered. My pottery records mattered. That was the sentence I kept returning to. My pottery records mattered. All those late nights when I photographed mugs on a white bedsheet. All those shipping labels I saved because I was careful. All those booth receipts folded into envelopes. All those tiny payments I tracked because my little shop was too small to survive sloppy bookkeeping. Every habit Richard had mocked became one more brick in the wall between me and his ruin. But the house was still a problem. Our yellow-sided house in Cedar Rapids had been tangled into Richard's financial mess before I ever understood what was happening. Patricia fought hard. She negotiated. She challenged what could be challenged. She made sure the money from Belle's hearth pottery was not treated like some open drawer Richard could reach into. She protected what she could, but she did not lie to me. "Annabelle," she said one afternoon, sitting across from me in her office, "I can help you preserve value. I can help protect your separate records and income, but I cannot promise you will keep the house." I nodded because I had already cried too much in front of her and was tired of feeling like a cracked cup someone kept setting carefully on a shelf. "I know," I said, but knowing did not make it easy. The day I returned to pack, Emily came with me. So did Grace, my daughter. I had not wanted to pull Grace into the worst of it at first. Mothers make that mistake. We think shielding our children from pain means keeping them innocent. But Grace was 41, with 2 nearly grown children of her own, and when she found out how much I had carried alone, she cried in a way that made me wish I had told her sooner. "I would have come," she said. "I know, no, Mom. I would have come the first night. That broke me more than I expected. Because I had spent so many years thinking my job was to make everyone else's life lighter, I forgot love sometimes wants to carry weight. The house felt different when we stepped inside. Not haunted exactly, exposed. The kitchen table still had a faint mark from where hot casserole dishes had been set without trivets. The hallway still held the tiny dent from when Grace at 16 slammed the laundry basket into the wall because she was angry about curfew. The guest room still smelled faintly of lavender sachets. My mother's favorite chair was gone, but I still saw her in the corner near the window, wrapped in a blanket, asking if the tea was fresh. Then there was the garage. I stood in the doorway for a long time. The wheel sat quiet. Shelves lined with unfinished pieces. A jar of brushes near the sink. Bags of clay stacked under the table. The space looked exactly the same and completely changed. This was where I had learned to breathe again. This was where Richard's contempt could not reach me at first. This was where it finally reached too far. Grace touched my shoulder. "We'll move all of it." "All of it?" I asked. She looked at me like I had asked whether we should save oxygen. Every tool, every shelf, every ugly bucket of mud. I laughed then. A real laugh. Small, but real. We packed the garage before anything else. Not the china cabinet, not Richard's awards, not the framed photographs where we smiled like people who knew the whole truth. The pottery came first. Grace's husband brought boxes. Emily labeled them. My grandson carried bags of clay and complained about how heavy they were until Grace told him, "That heavy clay saved your grandmother, so hush." He went red and stopped complaining. Piece by piece, Belle's hearth pottery left that garage. It felt like rescue. Richard was not there. He had moved into a short-term rental after the hearing, though he still sent messages through lawyers and occasionally through guilt. He lost Scott & Sons renovations faster than I expected. Once the story spread through vendors and clients, the image he had polished for years collapsed like wet cardboard. Men who once laughed at his jokes stopped returning calls. The country club membership went unpaid. His trucks were surrendered or sold. His name, once said with respect in local construction circles, became something people lowered their voices around. I did not celebrate that. I need you to understand this. I did not dance in the ashes of his life. For 38 years, his life and mine had been braided together. When one strand burns, the other smells smoke. Watching Richard fall did not feel like victory. It felt like seeing a bridge collapse after I had finally crossed it. Still, I did not go back. That matters more than whether I hated him. I moved into a small house near Grace in Marion. It was not impressive. 1 story, 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a little fenced yard with tired grass and a maple tree that leaned slightly left. The garage was smaller than the old one, but it had a window facing east. Morning light came through that window in a way that made the dust look almost holy. The first night there, I slept on a mattress on the floor because my furniture had not arrived yet. Boxes surrounded me. My body ached. My marriage was over. My house was gone. My future was smaller than I had once imagined. And still, I slept. No footsteps in the hallway. No truck in the driveway. No key turning late at night. No voice saying, "You worry too much." The silence did not accuse me. It held me. A week later, Linda Parker called. Yes, that Linda. The woman who had bought the cream mugs and written the review that made me cry at my kitchen table. I had not heard from her in months except for a holiday order. Her voice was warm and hesitant. Annabelle? Yes, that Linda. The woman who had bought the cream mugs and written the review that made me cry at my kitchen table. I had not heard from her in months, except for a holiday order. Her voice was warm and hesitant. "Annabelle," she said, "I hope this isn't a bad time." I looked around my half-unpacked kitchen and almost smiled. "That depends on what you're about to say." She laughed softly. "Fair enough." Then she told me about Willow Creek Women's Center, a support organization in Cedar Rapids that helped older women beginning again after divorce loss, abuse, or financial crisis. They were planning a spring gathering, something gentle and practical. Tea conversation, resource tables, donated blankets, local speakers. We wanted handmade mugs for the women, Linda said. Something they could take home. Something that felt personal. I thought of you. I could not answer right away. She grew nervous. It would be a paid order, of course. A large one. But only if you're able. Able. For so long, Richard had treated me as if I were barely capable of understanding my own life. Now someone was asking if my hands could make comfort for women who needed proof they were still worth tenderness. "Yes," I said, my voice thick. "I'm able." That order became the first real work of my new studio. Grace helped me install shelves. Emily brought coffee and a label maker. My grandson built a crooked but usable packing table. We hung a small sign above the wheel, Belle's Hearth Pottery. Not in the garage corner anymore. Not hidden behind Richard's truck's paint cans or old tools. Mine. The first mug I threw in that new studio came out uneven. My hands were nervous. The rim dipped slightly on one side. The handle sat lower than I wanted. I almost crushed it and started over. Then I stopped. I held it in both hands and thought maybe not everything that survives has to be perfect. Maybe it just has to hold. The mugs for Willow Creek Women's Center took me 6 weeks. I could have made them faster. Years earlier, I would have rushed. I would have worried about disappointing people. I would have stayed up too late, skipped meals, and told myself that exhaustion was just another form of being useful. But I was learning a different way to live. So I made them slowly, one at a time. I chose a warm cream glaze with soft blue at the rim, the kind of blue that reminded me of morning before the world starts asking for anything. I pressed a tiny leaf pattern near the base of each mug. Not perfect leaves, not identical. Just a small mark to say this was touched by human hands. This was made with attention. This was not stamped out by a machine or rushed through fear. On the bottom of each mug, I carved one word. Begin. Linda cried when I showed her the first finished batch. She held one in both hands and said, "Annabelle, these women are going to feel this." I looked away because praise still embarrassed me. Richard's voice had lived in my head too long. Even after he was gone, part of me expected every compliment to be followed by a joke, a correction, a little knife hidden in a smile. But Linda meant it. So I let the words land. The event was held on a bright Saturday morning at Willow Creek Women's Center. The building was modest, brick front, wide windows. A small garden bed by the entrance with early spring tulips pushing through cold soil. Inside, volunteers moved around with clipboards, coffee urns, name tags, and the gentle urgency of people trying to make hurting strangers feel welcome. I arrived early with Grace and Emily. My grandson carried 2 boxes and whispered, "These are heavier than they look." Grace gave him a look. He quickly added, "In a meaningful way." I laughed, a real laugh. That sound still felt new coming from me. We unpacked the mugs on a long table covered in a white cloth. Each one had a small tag tied to the handle with twine, handmade by Belle's Hearth Pottery. For new beginnings. I stood there looking at them, and for a moment I saw the whole road behind me. The garage floor, the broken vase, the USB drive in my palm, Patricia's office, Richard's face in court, the yellow house fading in the rearview mirror. Then the women began to arrive. Some came in groups, some alone. Some dressed carefully, as if trying to prove they were still holding themselves together. Others looked tired in a way makeup could not soften. There were widows, divorcees, women who had survived controlling marriages, women recovering from financial betrayal, women who had spent decades being told they were too old, too emotional, too dependent, too late. I recognized pieces of myself in all of them. Not their exact stories, their posture, the way some clutched their purses close, the way others scanned the room before sitting down, the way a few smiled too quickly the way I used to, before anyone could ask what hurt. Linda introduced me before the tea service. I wanted to refuse. Public speaking had never been part of my plan. Then again, neither had bankruptcy, forgery, or starting over at 62. So I stood. "My name is Annabelle Scott," I said. The room quieted. "I make pottery." For a long time, someone close to me called it a waste of time. A few women nodded, not politely, knowingly. I held one of the mugs in my hands. I used to believe him a little, not all the way, but enough that I kept my joy small, enough that I apologized for it, enough that I said, "It's just a hobby," before anyone else could laugh first. My voice shook. I kept going, but that hobby became my income. Then it became my records. Then it became my proof. And finally, it became my way back to myself. No one moved. I looked down at the mug. Clay has to be centered before it can rise. But sometimes, when life knocks us off center, it doesn't mean we're ruined. It means we have to place our hands back on the wheel and begin again. That was all I said. It was enough. Afterward, women came to the table and chose mugs. Some ran their fingers over the leaf pattern. Some turned them over and read the word "begin" silently. One woman, probably in her 70s, held a mug against her chest and said, "I forgot things could still be mine." I had to step into the hallway after that. Not because I was sad, because healing can overwhelm you too. Months passed. Belle's hearth. Pottery grew steadily, but not wildly. I liked it that way. I made mugs, bowls, butter dishes, vases, and custom pieces for women who wrote me long messages about mothers, sisters, second marriages, empty houses, and new apartments after divorce. I started teaching a small pottery class once a week at Willow Creek. The first class was a disaster in the most beautiful way. Clay collapsed. Bowls leaned. Handles cracked. One woman named Marjorie made a mug so heavy we joked it could survive a tornado. Another woman cried because her hands had arthritis and she thought she had failed. I sat beside her and said, "A thing doesn't have to be perfect to be worth keeping." She looked at me as if no one had told her that about herself. Maybe no one had. At the end of each class, I watched women carry home crooked bowls with more pride than some people carry trophies. Those bowls had fingerprints in them, uneven rims, glazed surprises, small flaws, realness. I loved them for that. Then, in late summer, a letter came from Richard. Not a legal document, a personal letter. I knew his handwriting before I opened it. That familiar slant, that heavy pressure, that confidence that used to look like strength. I sat in my studio with the envelope in my lap for nearly 10 minutes. Then I opened it. He wrote that he had lost everything. The company, the house, most of his friends, his reputation. He said the bankruptcy had destroyed. I sat in my studio with the envelope in my lap for nearly 10 minutes. Then I opened it. He wrote that he had lost everything. The company, the house, most of his friends, his reputation. He said the bankruptcy had destroyed him as if it had happened to him instead of through him. He said he thought about me often. He said he was sorry for how things turned out. Not for what he did, for how things turned out. That was Richard until the end. Even apology had to leave him an exit. Near the bottom, he wrote, "After all these years, I thought you would understand." I folded the letter carefully. Then I placed it in the bottom drawer of my work table. I did not answer. Not every letter deserves a reply. Some only arrive to prove you are no longer the woman who needs to send one. That afternoon, I threw a bowl. A simple one. Wide, low, steady. My hands knew what to do. The clay rose under my palms, softened, widened, became useful. When it dried to leather hard, I carved 2 words into the bottom. Not wasted. I kept that bowl for myself. Now, most mornings, I drink tea in my studio while the sun comes through the east window. The shelves are full. The kiln hums. My hands are older, yes. Sometimes stiff, sometimes sore. But they are mine, and that matters. For a long time, I thought my hobby saved me from Richard's bankruptcy. But that was only part of the truth. It saved me from his version of me, the small woman, the confused woman, the woman who signed whatever he put in front of her. That woman was never real. She was only the shape his contempt tried to press me into. The real me was there all along, hands in clay, making proof, making beauty, making a life that could survive fire. If there is one lesson I learned from everything Richard put me through, it is this: never let someone who benefits from your silence define the value of your voice. For years, I thought I was simply making mugs and bowls in a garage. I thought I was filling lonely afternoons. I thought I was giving my hands something to do after grief had taken too much from me. But sometimes, the small things we do to survive become the very things that save us. A hobby can become income. Income can become independence. Records can become proof. And proof can become the first step back to your own name. No woman is too old to begin again. Not at 55. Not at 62. Not at 75. If something brings you peace, protects your dignity, or reminds you that you still belong to yourself, it is not a waste of time. The wrong people will mock what makes you stronger because they can feel you becoming harder to control. So protect your joy. Protect your paperwork. Protect your private strength. And when someone calls your dream foolish, ask yourself why they are so afraid of you having one. Have you ever had someone dismiss something you loved only to realize later that it was part of your strength? Tell me in the comments. I would truly love to read your story. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me for more emotional family stories about betrayal, justice, and healing.